I was making tea in the quiet kitchen, the sunlight slanting across the countertop, when I noticed the envelope lying on the floor near the door, plain, unmarked, and unassuming. It could have been mistaken for junk mail, except for the handwriting. My hand froze in midair before I even touched it. The loops, the curves, the way the letters slanted it was unmistakable. Ellis. I knelt down, heart hammering, and picked it up slowly. My fingers trembled as if the envelope itself carried some small electric charge, a pulse of the past, of a life I had been told was gone. I slid the flap open carefully, afraid that I might undo some fragile equilibrium just by looking. Inside was a card, cheap and generic, the kind with soft watercolor flowers and simple script wishing a happy birthday. But that wasn't what made me pause. The handwriting inside was his, every flourish, every loop, a memory I had buried for years. And then I read the words, slow, deliberate, almost impossible. I never left. Look in the basement. The card slipped from my fingers and fell to the floor. My stomach dropped as a wave of disbelief and panic washed over me. 2 decades of absence, grief, and unanswered questions all compressed into those 8 words. I stood there, frozen, staring at the card, unable to move, my mind racing with questions I couldn't even begin to answer. The silence of the house felt heavier than usual, the light in the room too bright, the air too still. Years of imagining his final moments, picturing an empty river, a body lost to the current. Suddenly, all that certainty had vanished. For a long moment, I just held the envelope, letting the words settle into me, realizing that my quiet life of careful solitude was about to change forever. The basement door loomed in the hallway, its dark outline sharper than it had in years, and I knew I had to face it. As I set the envelope aside, my mind drifted back nearly 20 years to the days when the house was alive with small, ordinary routines. I remembered mornings in our quiet Lancaster neighborhood, the scent of fresh bread from the bakery down the street, Ellis leaning over the kitchen counter reading the newspaper while I packed Maris's lunch for school. Every day had a rhythm, predictable and comforting. Ellis had a way of showing love without saying much. He folded his socks with precision, always left 2 sips of coffee in the pot, and would slip a little note into Maris's lunchbox. Have a good day. Don't forget to smile. Those gestures were small, almost invisible to anyone else, but they anchored me to a life I had trusted completely. I had believed that predictability meant safety, that the ordinary was the truest form of love. But even then, there were subtle hints that something was shifting. Ellis started taking long evening walks, often without explanation, sometimes returning hours later, flushed and secretive. He began spending more time in the basement, claiming he was organizing old boxes. Yet the hours he spent there often stretched beyond what seemed reasonable. I had told myself it was nothing, that everyone needed space. I hadn't noticed how those spaces began to hollow our connection, how his quiet absences quietly chipped away at our life together. I thought of Maris, her second year in college in Vermont, calling twice a week to share stories and updates. Ellis loved her fiercely, in his own measured way, sending extra socks in the winter, clipping newspaper articles he thought might interest her. And yet, as I recalled those gestures, I realized how little attention I had paid to the small signs of his changing patterns. The basement door left slightly ajar, his unexplained phone calls, the evenings that became progressively lonelier. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of all those years. Love, devotion, comfort, and the quiet erosion of it all. Had I missed the warning signs? Or was his disappearance always planned? The envelope sat on the counter, its words echoing louder now, drawing me toward the basement, where the answers I had been avoiding waited in the shadows. I remembered the morning Ellis disappeared, like it had been carved into the walls of my mind. His car was found abandoned by the river an hour north of town. The engine cold, the keys still in the ignition. Inside were his wallet, his phone, and even his wedding band. Everything that belonged to him except him. The police spoke of strong currents, the kind that could carry a body away without a trace. They suggested suicide. I wanted to believe them, yet a quiet part of me resisted. Holding on to some impossible hope, the memorial followed. The hollow echo of an empty coffin standing where he should have been. Friends and neighbors offered condolences, casseroles, and sympathetic smiles, but nothing filled the void. I grieved, I hated, I forgave. I grieved again, each emotion layering over the other until they became a heavy silence that filled the house. Over the next 10 years, I carried that emptiness with me, moving through days like a shadow, performing the motions of life while the walls whispered memories of a man who had been everywhere and nowhere. Even amidst the isolation, I noticed the little things that had once seemed insignificant. The basement door, always closed, became an object of quiet curiosity. He had spent hours down there organizing old boxes and old furniture, claiming mundane tasks. Yet there was a rhythm to it that now struck me as deliberate. The faint scuff of boots on the stairs, a door left slightly ajar. Small traces that seemed trivial at the time had begun to accumulate in my memory. They were the echoes of a life that might not have ended as I believed, the faint pulse of a secret buried beneath the ordinary. I walked through the empty rooms of the house, recalling how we had once shared them, the way light used to fall across the countertops in the morning, the creak of floorboards that used to signal his presence. All of it felt like a carefully constructed illusion now. Those ordinary patterns, the little rituals and habits, had been the backdrop against which he could disappear without warning, leaving me to question everything I thought I knew. And yet, as I held the card in my hands, staring at the words that refused to make sense, a thread of recognition pulled me toward the basement, the place that had always been there, quietly waiting, as if it held the answers I had been too afraid to uncover. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, the card still clutched in my hand, and hesitated. The door had always been there, a simple wooden barrier that separated the main floor from a space I had only entered a handful of times in the past 20 years. Now, it felt like the threshold to another world, one that might explain everything or unravel me completely. My fingers trembled as I reached for the cold brass knob. The silence in the house pressed against me. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the clock, even the occasional creak of the floorboards all seemed amplified. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath, telling myself I was not imagining anything, that I was not hallucinating the possibility that Ellis could still be alive, but the truth hovered at the edge of my mind. Impossible to grasp and impossible to ignore. I turned the knob slowly. The door resisted at first, as if it knew I wasn't supposed to enter. When it finally swung open, the stale air of the basement brushed against my face, carrying the faint scent of dust and old wood. I flicked the flashlight on, the beam cutting through the darkness in a narrow cone, revealing the familiar clutter of years' boxes stacked haphazardly, sheets draped over old furniture, and the faint outline of shelves that hadn't been touched in decades. Step by step, I descended, each footfall creaking beneath me. My heart pounded in my ears, and I imagined every scenario at once. Maybe it was a prank, a cruel joke left by someone I didn't even know. Maybe Ellis had written the card before he disappeared, some bizarre way of tormenting me. Or maybe impossibly, unbelievably, He was alive, and this basement held the proof. I forced myself to focus, taking in every detail, scanning the shadows. The beam of the flashlight fell across a box that seemed newer than the others, edges unmarked by time, taped tightly. My hands itched to open it, but I paused, remembering the years of grief, the empty spaces, the unanswered questions. Could I face the truth? Whatever it might be, could I bear it if it destroyed everything I had built from his absence, somewhere deep inside me? Beneath the fear and hesitation, a jagged thread of hope clung stubbornly. It made my stomach twist and my hands shake. But it was there. I knew I had to see it through, to confront the basement and whatever secrets it had guarded for 2 decades. I stepped closer to the box, my breath catching with each movement. The light trembled in my hand, casting long shadows across the walls. The house had been silent for years, but now it felt alive, watching, waiting for my next move. And as I knelt before the box, I realized that nothing would ever be the same once I lifted the lid. The basement had kept its secrets long enough, and it was time to face them. My hands shook as I reached for the edges of the box. Dust rising in tiny clouds that caught in the beam of my flashlight. It was heavier than I expected, and as I lifted it onto the floor, the contents shifted with a muffled thud. I hesitated before opening the lid. The years of longing, fear, and grief pressing down on me like a physical weight. My fingers traced the seams of the cardboard, each fold a reminder of all the mornings I had spent imagining the finality of Ellis's disappearance. Inside, there were letters, neatly stacked and bound with faded ribbons, photographs tucked carefully between folders, and envelopes addressed in handwriting I did not recognize. My heart caught in my throat as I picked up the first letter. Seeing the signature at the bottom, Jonathan E. Garrison, the name felt like a slap. Familiar yet foreign. A ghost of the man I had loved and mourned. As I flipped through the photographs, my world tilted. Ellis, smiling beside a woman I had never seen, a child in his arms, another standing close by. The children were young, the faces soft, innocent, untouched by the years I had endured in their father's absence. Receipts, airline tickets, and IDs revealed a life meticulously hidden, a life built while I had been grieving, while I had been imagining rivers and empty coffins. Every document, every image was proof that he had not vanished by accident, but by design. I sank to the concrete floor, the box cradled in my lap, and felt a storm of emotions batter me from the inside. Shock first, an icy disbelief that this could be real, then betrayal, sharp and burning, that he could live a second life without me, without Maris, without even a word of goodbye. Grief followed, heavier this time, layered with rage and the hollow ache of years wasted on the illusion of his death. Somewhere beneath all of it, faint but insistent, hope began to rise. Not the innocent, naive kind, but a jagged, trembling thread that suggested there might be answers here, that I might finally understand the truth behind every absence, every silence, every night he disappeared into the basement. I sorted through the letters carefully, recognizing patterns and timelines. His meticulousness had always been part of his character, but this was obsession elevated to another level. Each name, each location, each document was a brushstroke in a life that had existed entirely outside of mine, a shadow world that I had no part in. Yet, as much as I felt erased, as much as my heart threatened to crack from the betrayal, I realized something crucial. I had found the evidence. I had found the control he thought he had over my story. The air in the basement seemed heavier, charged with the gravity of what I now knew. Ellis had not vanished. He had hidden carefully, deliberately, creating a life that erased me entirely. And as I stared down at the letters, photographs, and documents spread across the floor, I felt the first stirrings of resolve. It was time to understand the full extent of what had happened, and to decide what I would do with the truth. I gathered the papers, letting the weight of the revelation settle, and prepared myself for the steps I would have to take next. The secrets of the basement had been unveiled, and now I had to act. I spent the morning sorting through the contents of the basement box, arranging letters, photographs, and documents into piles that made sense only to me. Each folder became a small map of Ellis's hidden life, a timeline I had never been part of. I made notes on every detail, cross-referencing dates and names, trying to piece together the puzzle he had left behind. The enormity of it threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to breathe and focus. By afternoon, I had contacted a private investigator, a sharp, discreet woman named Denise, who ran a small office downtown. I didn't need theatrics or someone who would dramatize the case. I needed precision, someone who could track the trail Ellis had left without alerting him. Denise nodded as I handed her the folder, her eyes scanning the contents quickly and efficiently. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. "You'll have answers in 10 days, she said simply. Her confidence steadied my nerves. Next, I reached out to a lawyer, specializing in family law and fraud. I explained the situation without embellishment, showing the documentation of false identities, hidden accounts, and evidence of his second family. He reviewed the documents carefully, highlighting steps we could take, formal records to nullify his second marriage, flagging financial accounts, and establishing the legal consequences of his deception. I listened closely, taking it all in, feeling a sense of control I hadn't felt in decades. For the first time in years, I felt calm. The chaos of grief, confusion, and betrayal had shifted into something actionable. I was no longer a passive participant in the aftermath of his choices. I was directing the course of the story that had been stolen from me. Each decision, each phone call, each document filed gave me a little more of myself back. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with all the evidence spread before me, thinking about the steps ahead. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the truth, asserting control, and ensuring that the life he had hidden from me would no longer remain untouchable. I finally understood that empowerment wasn't loud or dramatic. It was deliberate, careful, and unwavering. I prepared myself for the next stage, knowing that confronting him directly would be inevitable, and that the foundation I was building now would determine the outcome of what was to come. The park was quiet when I arrived. Gray spring sky above and the early chill in the air. I chose a bench halfway between where I lived and where Ellis Jonathan, as he now called himself, had established his second life. I arrived early, giving myself time to settle the tension in my chest, to steel my voice and my resolve. I was not here for drama or anger. I was here to reclaim the story he had stolen from me. When he appeared, walking slowly along the path, I barely recognized him at first. The man I had loved was older now, hair streaked with gray, a shadow of the vitality I remembered. His steps were measured, tentative, as if he feared the weight of my presence. He stopped near the bench, hesitated, then sat, leaving a deliberate space between us. I spoke first, calm and controlled. "Jonathan," I said, using the name he had chosen. "You left a life behind without explanation. I have the evidence, and I am not here to argue about it. I am here to set boundaries and make it clear what the consequences of your actions are." He swallowed, eyes darting briefly to the documents I had brought with me. I didn't know how to tell you," he said quietly. "I thought maybe it would be easier this way." His words were almost a whisper, and I could hear the tremor of guilt or fear beneath them. I held his gaze steadily. You thought what that disappearing, creating a second family, and hiding your life would be easier for you or for me? You erased me from my own life, and you expected me to accept it silently. He flinched, but said nothing. I continued, detailing the legal ramifications, the nullification of his second marriage, the flagging of financial accounts, and the fraud investigation already underway. My voice did not waver. Each word was deliberate, measured, a reflection of the control I had reclaimed over the situation. He finally spoke, admitting a mix of selfishness and fear, the moral ambiguity of his choices, the misguided attempt to protect himself from some imagined collision of lives. I listened without interruption, understanding now that the man I mourned had never truly faced the consequences of honesty. And yet, I was no longer trembling or pleading. I was assertive, composed, and fully in control of my narrative. My grief had been transformed into determination, my confusion into clarity. I had the power here not through threats, not through rage, but simply through truth and unwavering presence. When I stood and gathered my documents, I left him there, seated and confronted with the life he had hidden. I walked away slowly, each step deliberate, knowing that the next chapter would be about rebuilding my life on solid ground. When I returned home, the house felt different, though nothing had changed. The same walls, the same furniture, the same rooms. But now I moved through them with a sense of ownership I hadn't felt in decades. The basement, once a place of mystery and dread, had been cleared. I sorted through the remaining boxes, keeping what I needed and letting go of the rest. The card that had started it all was placed carefully in the fireplace, its edges curling as I watched the smoke rise, carrying away the weight of years spent in uncertainty. I re-established routines that had been neglected: morning tea, tending the garden, walking the quiet streets near my home, checking in with neighbors who waved as I passed. Each action felt deliberate, a small reclamation of the life that had been suspended while Ellis's secrets shaped my world. Maris called in the afternoon, and I spoke to her openly for the first time about everything I had discovered. Her voice was cautious, but there was relief in it, a recognition that the shadows we had lived with were finally illuminated. We talked at length, sharing laughter and tears, bridging the gap that years of silence had widened. I realized that in reconnecting with her, I was also reconnecting with myself. Evenings were quieter now, but they no longer felt empty. I prepared dinner with care, lighting the candles that had sat untouched for years. I set the table for myself, for Maris when she visited, for the life I was building. The weight of grief and betrayal remained, but it no longer dictated my movements. I had authority over my space, my time, my emotions. At night, I sat by the window, looking out at the street that had felt so isolating during Ellis's absence. The air was still, the neighborhood asleep, yet inside, I felt a pulse of certainty and calm I hadn't known in years. The past was present, yes, but it no longer had control. I had reclaimed my home, my routines, my dignity, and in doing so, I had begun to reclaim myself. With the basement finally cleared and the card gone, I felt the first true sense of closure. The next steps of my life awaited, and I would meet them on my own terms.